Okay, so this will be quick, but again, I will make sure the university gets copies of this presentation so that you can pore over it at your leisure. So I'm looking at four things today: developing a language for teaching and learning space, talking about space, looking at context, looking at ways we can map space and pedagogy, and a couple of case studies at the end to explain what we're talking about. So, as Adish said, I was involved in this research project for 2 years with the LTC, LTC grant, looking at the confluence of space, pedagogy and technology, an area that probably wasn't very well researched before. And it was really just trying to understand what space meant from my perspective. What does it mean for pedagogy? What does this room do? What does it enable or disable? And what does this room do? They're both lecture theatres, but they're actually fundamentally different. A seminar room and a seminar room, they're different, but why are they different and what do they actually do? A library and a library. This is a library we did at Ipswich, which is actually centred around a garden. Both libraries, but there's more to it than just the garden. What structurally is different about this space than the other one? So my research took me to the point, as an architect, trying to understand what pedagogy is. So what's interesting is that this is just a definition, but what I find interesting is it is student-centric. It's looking at experience. It's looking at environment as a complete package. So pedagogy is not just the art of teaching and learning practice. It's about a complete package of space and practice. As part of the research, we developed, we had to unpack pedagogy because you can't just look at space and just say, well, this is a teaching space, so therefore this is a pedagogy applied to that space. We need to understand the subtlety of what the pedagogy, the learning modalities are within the space. So we broke it down into four modalities. The didactic, which is the norm, I guess, in the past. Looking at active learning as investigation as groups, collaboration. The discursive mode, which is looking at discussing those group outcomes. And the final one is reflective, which is bedding down that understanding through assignments, projects, study in libraries and such. So when you look at the old model, which is the 20th century model, it was pretty simplistic. We had at one end of the spectrum the didactic content modalities, and at the other end reflective learning by rote, virtually. So if we're going to describe what a university was in the past, it was defined by and limited by the extent of content and their collection. So it's how good their library was and how good their academics were. It's just content. The challenge these days is that with the democratisation of knowledge, content no longer is no longer the currency for a university. So what is it? And if I can describe what a university is now, it's defined by the community of learners. It's fundamentally centred around that group of people who congregate within a common space. And that's critical in terms of the sustainability of what a university is. If we can bring people together, those students can leverage off each other, and how they share knowledge with each other is the way they improve. So are we providing spaces that support this sort of model? So this is a learning spectrum that we devised as a way to describe space within a university context, and it's heavily centred and weighted towards the didactic end of the spectrum, as well as the seminar and collaborative. And it's not a particularly sustainable model because it costs a lot of money to provide the space and to provide the lecturers to sustain the space, but it's not necessarily engaging the students. So something is fundamentally wrong. So in time, we're looking at universities that might actually completely change the weighting of space as it's distributed across the campus. And where it's most critically needed is in that area of peer-to-peer learning, which Sally talked about before, which is a critical interface for the students in terms of retention, as well as the ability for them to leverage learning off each other. So this is the extended spectrum, where at one end of the spectrum it's student-directed, and at the other end of the spectrum it's teacher-led. The middle section is where that's sort of a tipping point, which is really discipline-specific, either to research or to study. It's very easy for us to forget the communities that relate to spaces, and I think this diagram really is not a perfect diagram, but it does begin a conversation about space and community, and that is critical to understand what are the communities involved within that whole learning spectrum. And finally, the learning modality is not linear. It is dynamic, and it needs to be properly provisioned within space. So these are little metrics that we also developed to describe space. So this room would actually would sit close to the top little diagram, but it also enables potentially a good conversation to happen as well, which we're yet to see. But the reason we do this is that a lot of people don't understand how a space could be used, what's the expectation of its use, what's the student's expectation of what might be happening in a space. So we do these little diagrams just to remind ourselves about how spaces are enabled or in fact disabled. The other thing we developed as part of that research, it was to map pedagogy, and that was to basically sit in a classroom and map the cycle of what was actually happening under those four learning modalities. So you can see under the didactic traditional modality that it's almost like a musical score. You see the experience dominated in the didactic area, and it might fluctuate occasionally into discursive. But when we're looking at active teaching and learning, it is a much more dynamic musical score. And this is an important thing to understand, because it's not a linear process. We're not just simply moving through the different modalities and getting to the end point. We're switching rapidly between all of these modalities and engaging the learner. That's the whole point of this exercise, is to engage the learner. So this is how we start to both brief, design, and finally research space. We look at developing metrics that go under each of those learning modalities, so that we look at it from the lecturer's perspective, the participant's perspective. We look at it under the furniture and IT that's required. What are the tools and for the lecturer? What are the tools when we're dealing with active learning? What are the tools that are required for discursive feedback and ultimately reflective as well? So space can, as I said, can enable, but it can fundamentally disable pedagogies as well. And I'm very keen to liberate pedagogy through getting flexible space. And the reason we are in this situation is that and it's a relatively new phenomenon. Education is almost an industrial model, industrialisation of educational processes. So it really looked at the delivery of content for a particular cohort. 30, and for whatever reason, 25 to 30 people is the dominant room size in every university. It's probably because of that size, because you can see the whiteboard or the blackboard, you can hear everyone and talk in the room. But what it's meant is that when an architect is briefed with space, what they see is 30 people, and they just provide a standard room. So that what's actually happening is that they're not even asking the question about what pedagogy actually has to happen in the room. So the standards that are built now into facilities, if you say you want a room for 30 people, you get a room of a proportion that's based on a didactic model. That's just the way the standards have been written. So we really have to question at every point the size, the furniture, the technology of what's actually happening in the classroom before we brief the architect. This translates into technology spaces, and actually it also translates into large lecture theatres as well. There are standards written for all spaces, and we have to question all spaces now because they're not sustainable. So this is a lecture theatre. You can see this. I've put all the metrics up. There's a little framework on the right-hand side, which it's predominantly didactic. It's got no discursive because the students can't turn their heads, can't turn their chairs if students actually asking a question in the rear. Most students will look for about 5 seconds to see that person who's asking the question, and then they turn their head straight back to the front, and they virtually disengage. So it's not particularly productive in terms of that discursive modality. This is another lecture theatre, and you can see that the active and the discursive modalities are much higher. That's because particularly in the discursive modalities, the students can actually turn their chair completely around and actually face the student and eyeball them and have a conversation in the same room. So if you look at a cross-section of the room, it's like this. When the students are actually asked to look at active work, so doing a little bit of active work in a lecture theatre, the student can actually turn around and have a conversation in a small group, and then they can come back to the front. This is a secondary school. We did the didactic modality. We tailor it perfectly so that if I'm speaking to a group, I can eyeball everyone at the same level. I'm not looking up to the heavens to see the student at the back. So that's important for a didactic modality, and they can be heard. When we're looking at active, the students can turn their chairs around and do some group work, and the discursive modality is important to eyeball the other student. It's also important to be heard. So this sort of room has completely different acoustics to a normal room, a normal theatre. Most theatres have an absorptive ceiling, and this room has a reflective ceiling, so we can get the sound across the room. So looking at traditional modes and active modes, they're dramatically different. This is actually the theatre we're designing for JCU Townsville, in fact, which is under construction at the moment. So lecturer and participant, and when we're looking at the active modalities, there are particular characteristics that we're looking for, and we're looking for particular characteristics under discursive as well. A secondary school we designed for, which interestingly secondary schools have already migrated into more active pedagogies, but in this instance the spaces don't align to it. So what you see there is the grey is what they aspire to, the red is what's enabled. In other words, the space is actually disabling the pedagogy that they're aspiring to. This is the room that they now have. There's groups of 6 students have their own laptops, they bring them in. The students can share their work to a common screen. The lecturer can then share that content or those group outcomes around the room. And that we've developed rooms that no longer look at 30 as a sort of a default. We're looking now at leveraging larger cohorts in active learning environments that from 60 to 120. And because of the technology, even in a room of young adolescent males, we can control their behaviour through the technology. We can switch on and off information so that their behaviour is managed, but at the same time we can share their group outcomes easily. So what we're looking for is to be able to switch rapidly between those learning modalities to create almost a seamless dynamic through the room, a seamless pedagogy that's active through the room. And more importantly, we're very keen to look at what happens outside the classroom and how we can extend that learning beyond. So it's no point actually developing all these learning spaces, these teacher-led environments, if we don't support it with good social learning space that replicates to a certain extent what's happening in the classroom. So the relationship between teacher-led and student-directed is absolutely critical. So the social learning spaces used to be the library, and then more recently most people acknowledge that social learning spaces encapsulate everything from a cafe all the way up to any space. If it's not student-directed, if it's not teacher-led, it's students in every other space. But what I'm actually also very interested in is not just social learning, but this idea of peer-to-peer learning space, where there's a known cohort where those students can actually fundamentally support each other in that learning practice. So this is a first-year learning centre at the UQ. It has a range of furniture types. The room supports the first-year cohort. It has a curriculum advisor in there as well to support them. It has a space for students, tutors that come into the room to actually support the students as well. So this is a space fundamentally about supporting a known cohort in a prescribed space and giving them ultimate support. This is another one for Bond University, a range of learning spaces, learning configurations, furniture configurations that support different formats of learning. So we have laptop benches where they can come in quickly and use the space. We have active learning booths where they can do and extend that active learning from the teacher-led environment into a peer-to-peer learning space. So the Axon Learning Lab is one space that we have recently completed at the University of Queensland. It's for electrical engineering. The space on the top is what they had before, and the space at the bottom is what they've got now. So we did some critical research on the space. It's not just enough to, we'll design it and build it and then leave it. We've actually gone back and done a fair bit of critical research about the space. So this is what actually happens now. The teacher is no longer at the front of the lecture. The teacher, in fact, is in the middle of the room. Now, all of a sudden, that changes the whole relationship between academic and student. So, whereas before, if I'm standing in front of you, I'm the focus of the attention. I'm driving this conversation. Whereas with the academic in the middle of the room, they're the facilitator of the learning practice. So. This is retrofitted in a pretty weird, it's in an old laboratory. There's columns right through the middle of it, but that doesn't mean that we can't enable good learning practice to happen in this existing space. So there's 99 students in this room, which is a pretty large cohort. And I think what's interesting about this is if you put those 99 students in a lecture space, it's just simply one lecturer talking to 99 students. In this room, it's one lecturer talking to 11 groups. And each of those tables, there's one student per 9. So the student sees one of 9, and then they see one of 11. So it's actually breaking down the anonymous arrangement between lecturer and student. And that the students actually are set into groups, and if they don't turn up, the lecturer can quite quickly, as Sally talked about before, intervention about students who are not participating can be quite quickly noticed in a space like this, whereas if one of these people here didn't turn up, really, you just wouldn't know. So each of these, the room actually is supported with a storeroom which has their learning tools and the learning realia. Each group is of 9 and they break up in subsets of 3. The subsets of 3 have technology which is embedded in the wall that the lecturer can then deliver content to. The students can write over the walls. The students can publish their content onto the screen. The screen can then be distributed around the room. So even though there's 99 students in the room, without the students having to move, the lecturer can in fact share those group outcomes seamlessly throughout the whole space. The lecturer can also share the scribbles on the wall as well, so that the practice of thinking, the process of thinking through problems or problem solving can then be captured and then distributed right around the room as well. So when you look at unpack it in terms of the didactic, the active, and the discursive, each of those modalities has been specifically tailored within the space to enable that to happen. So we actually sat in the room and we mapped what was happening. You can see that the second line is that the active component, not every lecturer, of course, performed in the same way. We were getting a fair bit of diversity. So what that's saying is that it's not particularly where a lecturer on the third column is staying probably a little bit too long, I think, in the didactic modality. It's not saying that lecturer has poor teaching practice. It's probably saying that the lecturer is not well aligned to the space. We also mapped the space before and afterwards. What we actually got was a 50% increase in the square metre per person, per hour, per week efficiency. So this was actually some really surprising data. So taking it from, you can see the numbers of tutorial spaces we needed before to the number of spaces we need now, the numbers of hours actually delivered a significant benefit. Just finally, with the JCU project, what we're interested in here is connected learning. So this is actually looking at much more networks of, developing even more networks of connections between learning spaces, both teacher-led and peer-directed. Not in the middle of the building, the corridor is on the edge of the building, and the corridor is not just a corridor, it's a learning space. So what we're looking at doing is maximising every square meterage of space and looking at educational impact. So corridors really don't form part of this building at all. Every space becomes productive. So the lower floor has a teal type space and an active lecture theatre, and the spaces outside those spaces support students. So there's computers, there's spaces where students can actually extend learning. And this is, the top floor is actually a school of education. There's 2 active teaching spaces, but more importantly, there's a peer-to-peer learning space that is directly outside the doors of the lecturers, so that the student has much more ability to engage with the lecturer and get support, which is again what Sally was talking about before. So we're providing the infrastructure, hopefully, that enables the intervention and support for the student. Again, I'll publish these slides, but that's a teal space you saw before. These are some flexible learning spaces. We're defining it not as a lab, but a wet learning space and a dry learning space. One just has water and gas, the other one just has technology. The final statement is that if you take anything away from this talk, is that we need to develop a language about teaching and learning space, because once we can develop this sort of language, again, we're not talking across each other, we're talking with each other. And what we found with the QUT, we did a community of practice, a 6 months community practice experiment. And what we found was, just by discussing and teaching and learning space, we moved from talking about the technology and the furniture. We leave that by the end of 6 months, we talked about pedagogy. So the conversation begins with space, but it actually needs to end up in pedagogy. That's the space that we need to be in. Even though I'm an architect, I'm dealing with space, I fundamentally want academics to end up talking about pedagogy, because that's the way that you'll end up briefing designers significantly better than you have in the past. Thank you very much.